When Prince William stepped forward during a private royal gathering, no one expected what came next. In a voice steady but shadowed by years of silence, he unveiled a truth that had been locked away for decades: Princess Diana's Sapphire collection, one of the most iconic symbols of her legacy, was not meant for the crown, nor the vaults, but for one woman alone, Catherine. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The atmosphere in the room shifted in an instant. What had begun as a routine royal convening quickly descended into an emotional maelstrom. Senior royals were caught entirely off guard, their expressions betraying a mix of disbelief and panic. William, calm but resolute, reached into his coat and retrieved a sealed envelope. It bore the unmistakable crest of his late mother, Princess Diana, pressed deep into the wax, untouched for nearly 3 decades. Murmurs rippled across the chamber, but no one dared interrupt. With deliberate care, William broke the seal and began to read aloud a letter written in Diana's own hand, dated just weeks before the tragic crash that claimed her life. The silence was deafening as he reached the most devastating sentence: "My sapphires belong to the woman who carries my dignity, Catherine." The weight of that declaration landed like thunder. Some gasped audibly, others averted their eyes, unwilling to confront what this meant for royal tradition. Queen Camilla stiffened in her seat, her knuckles tightening around the armrest. Princess Anne, seated beside her, leaned toward Prince Edward, whispering something sharp and urgent. There was no protocol for this, no plan in place. This was not just an inheritance. It was a direct and personal wish from the woman who had haunted the monarchy ever since her death. William's voice never wavered. He didn't pause to gauge reactions, didn't allow the emotion in the room to stall him. He knew this moment was about more than jewels. It was about legacy, about honoring a mother who had been silenced in so many ways. He looked only at Catherine, seated across from him, her expression unreadable, her eyes brimming with questions. For years, the sapphires had been a source of speculation. Some believed they had returned to the royal vaults. Others whispered they were divided quietly among unnamed heirs. But now, the truth was laid bare. Diana had never intended them to be shared, nor displayed behind glass. She had chosen Catherine. Personally, the implications were staggering. Not only did this revelation reshape the narrative of Diana's final wishes, but it also reopened old wounds the royal family had tried desperately to bury. Questions began to swirl. How had this letter remained hidden for so long? Why had William chosen this precise moment to reveal it? And most damning of all, who knew about it before today and said nothing? The room was charged with more than shock. There was a creeping sense of betrayal, of power quietly shifting in a house built on centuries of secrets. The Sapphire collection, once thought to be a mere adornment, had suddenly become a royal reckoning. But how did such a monumental secret remain hidden from even the highest corridors of royal power? And why now? Long believed to be a transparent document, Princess Diana's will harbored a shadow clause, a codicil so deeply buried that even palace aides dismissed it as rumour. But now, in the light of William's bold announcement, the truth rises from the ashes. What had once been regarded as a straightforward testament to Diana's affection for her sons and public charities was suddenly recast in an eerie, more personal light. For decades, the official version of her will had been carefully managed, shared publicly in parts, and archived in the palace records with clinical precision. It allocated generous provisions to William and Harry, outlined guardianship in the event of her death, and conveyed her sense of duty to the causes she championed. But what no one outside her inner circle knew, what even members of the royal household were unaware of, was that a second clause existed, handwritten and heartbreakingly precise, known only to her solicitor and to William. This secret codicil didn't concern palaces or titles. It spoke instead of the personal treasures Diana feared would one day be swallowed by royal machinery. Jewelry she had worn not for ceremonial effect, but as armor symbols of her independence, her quiet defiance, her heartbreak, and among these the Sapphire collection stood paramount. Diana had made it agonizingly clear these pieces were not to be stored away, passed down by men who had misunderstood her pain. They were to belong to a woman she trusted would carry her legacy forward, untouched by compromise. She chose Catherine, not because of title or hierarchy, but because she saw in her a quiet resilience, what Diana once called grace under judgment. The codicil was brutal in its honesty. Diana expressed fears that the royal family might absorb her image into its machinery, softening her message for history's convenience. She warned of those who might twist legacy for comfort and insisted that her sapphires serve a different fate, not to dazzle, but to protect. The letter, echoing with sorrow and clarity, was a defiant act in itself. For years, William held on to this knowledge with silent determination, honoring his mother's wishes, waiting for a moment he felt she would have understood. And now, standing before the family, he had chosen to make it public not as spectacle, but as defense of truth. The revelation did more than shock the room. It shattered decades of assumption, exposing how even within the palaces of supposed transparency, shadows moved quietly. A mother's plea for dignity, buried in bureaucracy and sealed in trust, had waited patiently for a son's courage to bring it to light. And William, torn between tradition and tribute, had chosen to break ranks. This was no longer about wealth or titles. It was about loyalty to a woman whose spirit had never truly left the corridors of Kensington. As the monarchy reeled from the revelation, questions of trust, betrayal, and inheritance began boiling beneath the surface, and one woman stood at the centre of the storm. While the world speculated and insiders whispered, Catherine remained behind closed doors. But palace aides later described a scene of overwhelming emotion, grief, gratitude, and a crushing sense of responsibility. The moment William revealed the letter publicly, something in Catherine broke silently. Her composure at the gathering was flawless, but behind the fortress walls of Kensington, reality descended like a weight she hadn't prepared to carry. For years she had worn Diana's sapphire engagement ring with reverence, but this was different. This was not a gesture, it was a message. A crown passed not through titles, but through trust. When William handed her the full letter, she read it again and again, unable to fully accept what it implied. The words inked by Diana decades ago clung to her heart like frost. For you, when the world turns unkind. It wasn't just a gift, it was a lifeline wrapped in sorrow. She collapsed into tears in the privacy of her chamber, overcome by the burden of what Diana had left behind. Not wealth, not jewels, but expectation. It was as though Diana had reached through time and placed the future of her emotional legacy into Catherine's hands. And though the world saw Catherine as polished, poised, prepared for queenship, she knew this changed everything. The sapphires were no longer just stones, they were lightning rods. She wept not from vanity, but from fear. Fear that she could never live up to the vision Diana had seen in her. Fear that in accepting the gift, she would awaken bitter forces already circling in silence. William stood beside her that night, holding the sapphire ring, the same ring he once knelt with, now a talisman in a storm of expectations. He didn't speak much, but his presence said what words couldn't. This was the path his mother had chosen, and he would walk it with her. Still, Catherine's mind churned with doubt. The monarchy wasn't known for mercy. If Diana had gone to such lengths to hide this truth, what did she fear would happen if it were discovered? Catherine could feel the whispers already building behind heavy oak doors, where loyalties hifted like sand and history was rewritten to fit the agenda of the day. She was no stranger to tension among the senior royals. But this was different. This would not be seen as an honor. It would be viewed as disruption, an inheritance that undermined hierarchy, a private blessing that cast a public shadow. Her instinct for survival told her to tuck the sapphires away, to deny, to defer. But the letter wouldn't let her. Diana's final line echoed louder than all the rest. Wear them when they try to undo you, and remember, they feared me too. Catherine was no longer merely a future queen. She had become the vessel of Diana's defiance. But while Catherine mourned in silence, others within the palace were already plotting their next move with Camilla at the forefront. Insiders say the queen consort stormed into Clarence's house the very night the announcement was made, demanding immediate clarification. Her words were said to cut sharper than any royal protocol ever allowed. The moment William read aloud Diana's letter, something inside Camilla reportedly snapped. For years she had moved carefully, calculating her steps, adjusting her presence, and enduring public resentment as she ascended into the role of queen consort. But in one stroke, Catherine had been catapulted into the emotional epicenter of Diana's legacy, and for Camilla, that wasn't just inconvenient, it was humiliating. She had always assumed the Sapphire collection, so closely tied to royal prestige, would be absorbed into the crown's ceremonial assets. In her eyes, the gems were part of the monarchy's visual continuity, not a personal bequest to a rising rival. That assumption, it turned out, had been a critical miscalculation. Behind palace doors, the fury was immediate. Camilla didn't wait for morning. She confronted Charles that very night. Witnesses say her voice could be heard echoing through the hallways. She demanded to know whether he had known about the letter, about the codicil, about any part of this explosive inheritance that now threatened to redefine public perception. Charles, visibly worn by the tension, reportedly tried to de-escalate, pleading for unity and discretion. But Camilla was not interested in unity. She was fighting for survival in a family that never truly embraced her. And now, with Diana's posthumous voice dominating the narrative again, she saw her role teetering on the edge of irrelevance. Her fury wasn't just personal, it was political. She had already endured decades of public scrutiny, fought through scandal, and climbed a treacherous path to legitimacy. To now be blindsided by a letter from the past, one that placed her in Diana's shadow once more, was intolerable. She ordered her aides to seek legal counsel on whether personal heirlooms not listed as crown property could be reclaimed under royal decree. There was even whispered talk of reclassifying the sapphires as state assets, a maneuver that would rip them from Catherine's hands. In one heated exchange, Camilla is said to have warned Charles that she would take it to Parliament if needed, a threat that underscored just how deeply threatened she felt. For Charles, the moment became a test of allegiance. Bound to his late ex-wife's memory through his sons, yet committed to the woman he had chosen as queen, he stood paralyzed. Camilla demanded he take a stand, but Charles, perhaps sensing, the public tide turning toward William and Catherine, hesitated. That hesitation fractured more than just a conversation, it widened an already festering divide within the monarchy. For Camilla, this wasn't merely about jewelry. It was about losing ground in a battle she thought she had already won. Her fear wasn't rooted in jewels or tradition, it was about being eclipsed yet again in full view of a public that had never fully forgiven her. She knew the narrative was slipping, and worse, that Diana's influence was being resurrected through a woman far more beloved by the public than she had ever been. And in a monarchy built on image, perception is power. Camilla could feel hers slipping through her fingers, one sapphire at a time. But as tensions escalated within the palace walls, outside forces began to weigh in, including a voice from Diana's bloodline. Prince Harry, speaking from across the Atlantic, shocked the royal circle with a statement of his own. In it, he contradicted key elements of William's revelation, reigniting a sibling war that had barely cooled. The statement was brief, but its impact was seismic. From their home in Montecito, Harry released a message suggesting that his mother had once spoken to him, not William, about the sapphires. The assertion carried the weight of both memory and rivalry. According to Harry, Diana had told him that certain heirlooms would one day belong to him and his future wife, and among them, she had pointed out the sapphires. The moment he shared this recollection, the royal court was thrown into another tailspin. It wasn't just about conflicting memories. It was about two sons divided not only by geography and philosophy, but now by the very legacy of their mother. And the jewelry, which once symbolized her elegance, was now the flashpoint of renewed royal fracture. Sources close to the Sussexes claimed Meghan had encouraged Harry to speak his truth, reminding him that silence in the past had only allowed others to control the narrative. Within days, the couple sat for a new interview, raw, polished, and pointed. In it, Harry expanded on his earlier statement, suggesting that Diana had never wanted her possessions to become weapons of legacy politics. He stopped short of directly accusing William of fabrication, but the implication was clear. If William had been safeguarding Diana's letter, why had he waited so long? The media pounced instantly. Headlines exploded with speculation: Diana's sons at war again, Meghan and the mystery of the Sapphires, and legacy torn in two. Tabloids turned the jewels into battlegrounds. Royal commentators argued over timelines, intentions, and the optics of grief weaponized. William's camp did not sit idle. Almost immediately, insiders leaked details meant to reinforce his credibility. The letter, they stressed, was dated, authenticated, and sealed by Diana's own solicitor. It hadn't been unearthed for convenience, it had been held in trust until the time was right. A time, they implied, that coincided with Catherine stepping fully into Diana's symbolic shoes. Yet Harry's challenge unsettled even their most loyal supporters. Public opinion fractured. Some sympathized with Harry, seeing him as once again excluded from the royal narrative. Others questioned the motives behind his timing. Was it heartbreak speaking, or was it a strategic play, designed to recollect irrelevance amid a story that had moved on without him? The emotional toll was undeniable. Two brothers who had once walked behind their mother's coffin, united in sorrow, now stood on opposite ends of the same battlefield. And between them stood Catherine, now drawn into a legacy war she never asked for. The Sapphires had become something far greater than their material worth. They were symbols of memory, of loss, of who Diana had been and what her sons had become. Yet the world couldn't look away. The more the truth twisted, the more captivated the public became. And within the palace, whispers grew louder. Would Catherine stand firm, or would she step aside to silence the storm? With the brothers now divided by legacy, Catherine would face a choice that could reshape the monarchy's emotional future and its public image. In a moment as poignant as it was politically seismic, Catherine appeared at a private family gathering wearing the full sapphire set for the first time, signalling her acceptance of the gift and the burden it carried. The gathering, held at Windsor under the guise of a subdued ceremonial dinner, was anything but ordinary. It was orchestrated with deliberate privacy, attended only by senior royals and trusted confidants, yet the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. All eyes turned as Catherine entered, not with fanfare or spectacle, but with an unmistakable presence. Draped in Diana's sapphires, the earrings, the bracelet, the necklace, and the now world-famous engagement ring. She became something more than a duchess or future queen. She became the living embodiment of Diana's legacy. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the subtle shift of chairs and the breathlessness of history colliding with the present. Camilla, seated rigidly at the far end of the table, reportedly withheld applause, her expression stony. But it was Princess Anne, ever the quiet sentinel of family duty, who nodded in solemn recognition, a gesture that said more than any toast could. Then came William. Rising slowly, his voice steady, he offered words that had clearly been waiting for their moment. This, he said, motioning toward Catherine, was always meant for her. The simplicity of the statement carried weight far beyond its phrasing. It was an affirmation not only of his mother's wishes, but of Catherine's place not just within the royal family, but within its emotional spine. The speech was short, devoid of grand declarations but layered in meaning. It was an open rebuke to the recent noise, the speculation, the voices that had questioned the authenticity of the inheritance. And yet, it was not delivered in defiance. It was delivered with resolve, a quiet claiming of what had already been chosen long ago in silence. As for Catherine, she didn't respond with words. She didn't need to. The sapphires glistened not as ornaments but as testimony. She later made a single vow, addressed not to the family but to the foundation her late mother-in-law had built, that the sapphires would be worn only in support of the causes Diana cherished: humanitarian aid, mental health advocacy, children's rights. It was a symbolic move, but a calculated one. It repositioned the jewels not as weapons in a royal feud, but as tools for impact, disarming critics while doubling down on the emotional narrative Diana had crafted through a life of both pain and purpose. The moment was not universally celebrated. Some within the family viewed it as a spectacle, others called it necessary healing. But none could deny its power. The line between past and present had been crossed, and in doing so, Catherine had cemented her role not just as William's wife or the future queen, but as the keeper of Diana's voice, her unfinished work, her enduring truth. And while the room clinked glasses and formalities resumed, something darker lingered in the air, because not all of Diana's secrets had come to light. But behind the glittering ceremony, a darker truth lingered, one that involved palace secrecy, locked vaults, and a name not spoken in years. Buried in a forgotten section of the Kensington vaults were letters, diary entries never meant to surface until now. And within them lay truths not only about the Sapphires, but about Diana's fears for the future of her sons. It began with a routine inventory of archival material, boxes sealed, catalogued, and untouched since the late 1990s. Among the decades-old files, one item stood out: a leather-bound journal marked simply for William. The handwriting was unmistakable, faded, hurried, but undeniably hers. It was Diana, and within those pages lay more than memories. They carried warnings, coded sentiments, a mother's desperate attempt to leave behind a blueprint of protection. Royal aides were reportedly stunned by what they found. These were not diary entries meant for nostalgia. They were messages deliberate, curated, and painfully self-aware. And at their heart was a recurring name: Catherine. Diana had written of her growing distrust in those closest to the crown. One passage in particular sent tremors through the palace: if he remarries, and I believe he will, beware the woman who wears duty as disguise. The words were scathing, veiled, and yet terrifyingly precise. She never mentioned Camilla by name, but the implication was crystal clear. Diana had sensed a future where her legacy would be rewritten, reshaped, or worse, replaced, and in her final months, it seemed she took steps to ensure that would never happen. The sapphires were described in the journal not as jewelry, but as instruments of intention. They are not gifts, she wrote. They are protection and signal. Whoever wears them will know my truth and carry my voice where I no longer can. But the most haunting parts of the journal came not in her reflections on the monarchy or Charles, but in her thoughts about William and Harry. Her entries bore an increasing sense of urgency, as if she knew her time was limited. She wrote of their bond, of their innocence, and of her deep hope that nothing, not fame, not institutions, not betrayal, would ever divide them. Yet in what now reads like a chilling prophecy, Diana noted, they are different in heart. William will carry the weight of tradition. Harry will fight it. They will love each other, but they will be pulled in opposite directions. That is what frightens me most. That eerie foresight now felt less like maternal worry and more like a map of what had unfolded. Her words on Catherine were filled with an almost prophetic admiration. She had only met her briefly, but something in her tone suggested Diana saw her as more than just a suitable match. She listens without judgment. She steadies him. She is warmth without performance. If the crown is to survive the cold, it will need someone like her. These declarations, private yet loaded, reframed the entire Sapphire inheritance. It was never about beauty or symbolism alone. It was about endurance, about ensuring that the crown would one day have a conscience. The release of these letters, whether intentional or leaked, sent a fresh wave of emotional aftershocks through the monarchy. Critics scrambled to question their authenticity, while supporters saw them as a final act of maternal defiance. And through it all, the story of the Sapphires gained even more weight, more meaning, more consequence. They weren't just Diana's now, they were history's. As these revelations rocked the monarchy, a final twist emerged, one tied not to Catherine, nor to Camilla, but to a royal figure who had stayed silent. Until now, it was Princess Anne who broke her silence, delivering a fierce and unexpected speech behind palace doors. Her stance? Unapologetic. Her message? Diana's wishes are sacred and must be respected, no matter who feels displaced. For years, Anne had remained largely neutral in the emotional battles that rippled through the royal household. She was, after all, the stalwart, the one who valued duty over drama, who spoke little and observed much. But this time, silence wasn't an option. When the noise surrounding the Sapphire collection reached fever pitch, Camilla's fury, Harry's contradiction, Catherine's quiet dignity, Anne chose to speak. In a private but high-stakes meeting at Buckingham Palace, attended by senior advisors and family members, she delivered a statement so sharp, so clear, that even Charles reportedly sat motionless. She reminded the room that Diana was not just a former princess, but a mother. A voice that had been diminished in life and deserved to be amplified in death. And then she said the words that changed the tone of the entire gathering. Diana chose. We must honor her choice. Few knew the extent of Anne's connection to Diana. Their relationship was never publicly sentimental, but what the public didn't see was the shared mutual respect between two women bound by the brutal realities of royal life. Anne had seen how Diana was chewed up by the institution and left to navigate her heartbreak alone. She had also seen how Catherine bore the same pressures, the same scrutiny, only this time, with even greater expectations. That silent bond between Anne and Diana had now evolved into a vocal defense of the woman Diana had trusted to carry her legacy forward. Anne made it unmistakably clear. Catherine had earned her place not through bloodline but through dignity. The confrontation with Camilla, though never officially acknowledged, became the most talked-about moment within the palace walls. Sources claimed Anne challenged her directly, stating that royal entitlement could not override personal truth. Camilla, reportedly livid, attempted to frame the sapphires as property of the crown, only for Anne to interject and ask a chilling question: since when did tradition require us to erase a mother's final request? The weight of that sentence lingered long after the meeting adjourned, and the ripple effects were immediate. The Council of Privy Advisors, typically reserved in their influence, began to murmur about precedent, about respecting written intentions, about reputational risk. The media got wind of the clash, and headlines exploded. Princess Anne protects Diana's legacy. Queen's daughter defends Catherine. The Crown's silent general speaks. Public sentiment tilted again. Support for Catherine surged, and the palace found itself navigating treacherous waters where silence could no longer serve as strategy. Anne's intervention had done more than shift the mood. It had drawn a line between legacy and ambition, but perhaps the most significant outcome wasn't just Anne's defense, it was the signal it sent to William, that someone within the highest ranks of the family stood firmly behind him, and Catherine gave him the resolve to move forward, not just in words, but in action. Because while others battled over the past, he was already preparing a move that would ensure Diana's memory wasn't just preserved, it would be immortalized in a way no one could undo. And just as the royal family appeared to reach a breaking point, William prepared a final gesture, one that would redefine his mother's legacy forever. In a symbolic final act, Prince William declared the Sapphire collection a crown of compassion, a ceremonial set to be worn only by future queens who uphold Diana's values. The monarchy, fractured and reeling, found itself realigned with a mother's enduring truth. The announcement came not from behind palace gates or whispered in council chambers, but through a televised address, direct and unprecedented. William stood not as a prince demanding tradition, but as a son honoring conviction. With the world watching, he revealed that the sapphires once worn by his mother, and now by his wife, would never again be treated as mere accessories of royalty. Instead, they would represent a moral legacy, a standard not of bloodline, but of character. The collection, he stated, would be reserved for queens who demonstrated compassion over politics, service over ceremony. It was a decision not anchored in inheritance, but in intention. And in that moment, the monarchy took a rare and public step toward emotional accountability. Catherine's reaction was quietly powerful. She was present, but said little. The emotion on her face spoke volumes. This was not a triumph she sought, but a responsibility she now carried. As the camera lingered, she placed her hand over her heart, the same hand that bore the engagement ring that once belonged to Diana. She had not fought for this moment. She had not demanded to be seen, but now the entire world recognized her not only as the future queen, but as the living link to a woman who had changed the course of royal history. The public response was immediate. Support surged, headlines shifted, and social media erupted in praise for the couple's courage to stand against institutional rigidity and elevate values above protocol. Even Camilla, who had once stood at the center of the storm, retreated into silence, Her aides offered no comment, and privately sources claimed she had expressed regret not for the letter, not for the legacy, but for the battle she'd chosen. In distancing herself from the narrative, she tacitly acknowledged that the tide had turned. There was no going back. Diana's spirit had not been vanquished by time or politics. It had been resurrected, honoured, and woven into the fabric of a future monarchy. William's final words rang with gravitas that silenced even his critics. This is no longer about jewels, it's about honour. And in that single sentence he reframed the entire conflict. The sapphires were not spoils of royal lineage, they were emblems of pain, of love, of resilience. They were Diana's voice, echoing across generations. And through this bold declaration, William had not only defended his mother's wishes, he had etched them into the royal institution itself. This wasn't the end of a feud. It was the beginning of a new standard. Diana's vision, one rooted in empathy, truth, and emotional authenticity, was no longer a threat to the monarchy. It was now a cornerstone of its future. The jewels she once wore as symbols of resistance had become sacred markers of grace, and in Catherine that vision had found its most faithful heir. And so, through love, loss, confrontation, and courage, the sapphires became more than heirlooms. They became Diana's final eternal decree. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.